Inazuma's main archon quest concluded with the repetition of the word ambition, the weaponization of naive hopes, and the realization of true potential, a contrast of some sort that is reflected well with the theme of visions and delusions. Today, we are diving into the mechanisms of one's foolish delusions of grandeur, the mysterious counterfeit visions and its representations to the Harbingers and the Fatui members we know today. This video will be a mix of currently known information, lore interpretations, and future theories themed around delusions. Without further ado, let's begin. The delusions are best described as counterfeit and artificial visions, capable of granting a person elemental power without the need of a vision. Delusions were described by the NPCs as treasures of incredible power and are more practical than a vision since they're man-made. The delusions have a myriad of purposes, but mostly just to boost a person's current strength to be on par with a vision user. The source of these delusions are unknown, but we know what's giving it the elemental power is archon residue according to Sino. When he says archon residue, it's best thought that it's a demon god's power, not the actual 7 archons. Which makes sense, given it's mimicking the power of the demon gods. The word demon gods were used to talk about the gods that had the name from the Ars Goetia or the Lesser Key of Solomon, and there are 72 of these demons. This note is important later. As for where delusions are manufactured, we actually have multiple speculated sources. The most common one that we know of are the fatuis, distinguished by the symbol. But there might be other black markets for delusions. The first time we've ever seen a delusion was in the manga. This delusion actually looks much different from the ones we see in-game. This delusion was owned by Crepus, Diluc's father, but instead of the fatui crest, it's a circular pattern. Even Dottore, a harbinger who would definitely know about and have a delusion himself, was curious about the origins of Diluc's glove. At first, I actually thought this was a mistake narratively, but then I realized it was just so much simpler. There are other groups that have tried to mimic artificial visions and use the fatui's delusions as a framework. I believe that this is why Amber makes this important similarity between Crepus's delusion and the incident with Childe. Childe was a young girl experimented on by the fatui. Instead of receiving a separate vessel for the delusion, it was directly injected into her body. Amber notes that Crepus's delusion and Childe's black flames had the same scent of mistgrass. In the manga, we actually see what Childe was injected with, and this resembles the fatui season-mage's drop material, mistgrass wick, and pollen. Per the description of the pollen, strange spores created by mistgrass in enclosed spaces. They are the season's favorite food. The next kind of delusions were the ones mass-produced in Inazuma during the Archon quest. For clarification, this delusion factory is most likely one of the newer ones. Its establishment was what prompted the Taxus and Rito to change from money to crystal marrow. Crystal marrow was the material they used to create these delusions. This being here means that the fatui are actively looking for dead and potent archon power to harness for replication. The Tatarigami, for example, were amongst them. The problem though was that these delusions were most likely prototypes, meaning the damages to a person's body arrived sooner than more polished delusions. The delusions we most likely see in the fatui skirmishers are much better than the mass-produced ones in Inazuma, which do kinda make sense. The purpose of the delusion in Inazuma was to generate a black market, but the fatui didn't really have a reason to make sure that the resistance fully got the benefits of the delusion. Which means that the crystal marrow delusions are inferior to Signayan-developed delusions. But then we arrived at the important ones, the ones granted by the Tsaritsa herself. Allegedly, the delusions of the fatui, especially the Harbingers, are most likely the perfected delusions, the ones whose powers are the most potent and capable of longer use without severe backlash. Delusions are treasures of incredible power, granted by Her Majesty the Tsaritsa in person. Whether fate or vision, a delusion makes them all look like child's play. Still, not everyone can wield one. Beyond the 11 Harbingers, very few other fatui possess a delusion. Even so, for an ordinary mortal like me, a delusion is far more practical than a vision, which one can only get by the grace of the gods. I see that you don't own a vision either. How about it then? If you join the fatui, who knows? Maybe you really will come to possess a delusion. While this line feels sketchy given it's a lower-ranking member of the fatui saying this, we actually get more confirmation from Venti's explanation of the Harbingers. Additionally, in the original Chinese text, instead of telling Signora that she mimicked the smile of the Tsaritsa, it's instead this. Oh, So the reason you dare to mock me is merely because you hold power borrowed from your master. How she creates these delusions are unknown, but if we return to the archon residue, it really makes sense that her power is the most potent out of all the other delusions. She's a living archon with a gnosis presumably, making whatever power seeped out of her exponentially more powerful than the remains of some dead god. The powers of a delusion are its main appeal. In the manga, we see that the form this power takes is through black and purple manifestations. We see this in the form of Tartaglia's second phase actually, but what's interesting is that Signora's is pure white without a hint of that black and purplish energy. It's possible that it's just because Tartaglia's delusion is electro and Signora's is cryo. Now, while the delusion's elemental powers are great, there are horrible drawbacks to using one. First is that the user's life force is continuously seeped out. This is what happened with the members of the Resistance when delusions were distributed amongst them. On a worse note, usage could lead to imminent death. Diluc could have never anticipated the way this battle would end. His father, who had been denied admittance into the Knights and who was shunned by the gods, defeated the monster with an unknown evil power, before that same power backfired, mortally wounding Kripus himself. Kripus died shortly after in his son's arms. But it's possible that even members of the fatui suffer this consequence to a slower scale. Perhaps it is fair to say that only those who possess an obsession close to or even exceeding the level of delusion might be willing to join this group that so rebels against the heavenly principles, binding their remaining days to their delusions and burning as brightly as the stars. Of course, many of the fatui are simply consumed by power and are simple sadists. Nor are these states necessary in conflict. We also see that in the manga, delusions are able to cause horrible mental pain to the user, and those with weaker mental fortitude can suffer manic episodes and loss of control. More about this later. To cleanse a person from the effects of the archon residue, Sino actually had to exorcise it out of Childe through an important ritual. The ritual he did in the manga is known as the Lesser Banishing Ritual of the Pentagram. According to Wikipedia, the ritual is highly dynamic, using gestures, visualization, and the pronunciation of certain words of power, combining prayer and evocation as well as clearing and preparing a space for further magical or meditative work. The ritual is perceived as banishing any chaotic and impure forms of the elements from the magician's circle, tracing the pentagrams in the air and by the power of certain divine names, followed by an invocation of the spiritual forces ruling the elements to fortify and guard the circle. Formulation of the pentagrams, in which a banishing earth pentagram for the banishing ritual or an invoking pentagram for the invoking ritual, is drawn in the air at each of the 4 cardinal points and an associated name of God is vibrated. Yahweh, Adni, Ahi, and Agla for east, south, west, and north respectively. Understanding what the delusions are is fundamental to the next part, because now I want to dissect what do the delusions mean to each of the Harbingers. The delusions, in my opinion, is the Tsaritsa's biggest bargaining chip to garner the loyalty of the Harbingers. Some may see her power as a blessing, some might be impartial, and some might even see it as a nuisance. But the delusions are so integral to the Fatui's characters, both narratively and thematically, that it's impossible to ignore it. The delusions are the main reason people are afraid to question the authority of the Fatui and its Harbingers. It puts them on a militaristically superior pedestal. Even members that were seemingly human or ungifted by the gods could most likely rival beings like the Valen or the Adepti if they have strong enough delusions. But now I want to see what do the delusions mean to each of the Harbingers, and how do they view the power gifted to them by the Tsaritsa. Childe was actually the first time we ever saw a delusion in combat use, but to him, the delusion bestowed by the Tsaritsa was just the fruits of his labor and not really a gift. His view on his own delusion is pretty indifferent, seeing it as just a tool to further his goals for world domination. Tartaglia's delusion is his old badge of honor and the proof of his strength. He still remembers with perfect clarity the day he received his delusion and ascended to become a member of the Harbingers. It was his reward for slaying many terrible beasts, and a memento of countless battles. But it was not this that brought Tartaglia joy, for honor is the natural reward of the warrior, nor did he pay any mind to the odd looks his new colleagues were giving him, for the opinions and bellyaches of others meant nothing to him. To him, his electro-delusion is just the same as his vision and the heretical teachings from the abyss, all tools for the same goal. But this delusion was what symbolized his loyalty to Tsaritsa's cause. When he was presented with the delusion, the sight of the Tsaritsa made him realize that they were the same. The sight of the Tsaritsa on her lofty throne alone stirred the young man's heart with respect and admiration, not merely because she opened the way for him to find an abundance of looming battles, but also because of the way she looked upon him. Her gaze was cold but pure, arrogant yet sharp. She was not only the sacrosanct cryo-archon, but also a true warrior. Thus did Childe, having received his delusion, swear an oath of fealty to the one and only Tsaritsa of Snezhnaya. Now, while Tartaglia's acceptance of his delusion was lacking, Signora's is another story altogether. The delusion for Signora was the erasure and concealment of her treacherous past. Cryo-delusion that she had symbolized her delusion of revenge towards the short-sighted and ignorant gods. The cryo-delusion carries heavy burdens for Signora, a feeble attempt of purifying the ashes of the dead. Let the flames that now devour you be extinguished by the grace of Her Majesty. What say you? The first fatui gave power to a young woman in whom the flame of life had all but died, and in her wild imagination, she saw the line that lay between the corrupt past and a stainless future. I understand. Then, let glacial eyes take the place of my erased past and extinguish these undying flames. Let the darkness of corruption, the pain of the world, and the humans, beasts, and the sin they carry, all be purified by silent ice. When you think of the word delusion, another aspect of it is coping. You lull yourself into bargaining for a better outcome than the one you have now, in hopes of changing an aspect of your life. But in the end, it's all just a delusion. Unfortunately, there is no changing that reality. Rosalind's delusion is the manifestation of her broken heart, several centuries of unparalleled grief. In her archive and the funerary mask, we get these lines of dialogue. Unlike other fatui who use the authority granted by delusions, where delusion is meant to shackle a flame that will devour everything, as opposed to a weapon used to kill, it might be more fitting to consider this a tool of imprisonment. And it was the embers of that flame, which had accumulated over many long years, that would break through the frosty seal of the delusion and apply a warped rogue upon her. The woman, whose real name was Rosalind Krutschka Lohelfalter, may have once led a more innocent, naive existence. But that was before her eyes were filled with a raging fire, and her innocent days were burnt away. Before the icy delusion extinguished the flaming tongues that ever gnawed her. Before the frozen might that protected her was shattered by the eternal outlander, unbound yet no less determined than she was, causing the flames to burst forth once more. The story of Scaramouche's delusion is actually unconfirmed at the moment, so it's at this point that we get to theorizing by building from the information we have in the husk of opulent dreams. I believe that Scaramouche's delusion represents the heart he had always desired. What I mean about it being a heart is several things, given the word heart is horribly vague to us humans. The delusion represents his lifeline, the gross mimicry of human emotion that he was desperately clinging onto. The delusion became the substitute for the gnosis he was promised, and its presence fed on that naivete that he required a heart for a fulfilling life. His delusion isn't a badge of loyalty like Signora or Tartaglia, but instead his perceived lifeline, actually contributing to the namesake, delusions, the delusions of grandeur that built the balladier's audacity, arrogance, and apathy. Breaking it down, we begin with the Bloom times. Scaramouche has a dream of a young man in the distant past much like himself, akin to a blank sheet of paper, pure yet fragile. The dream told him this: "You once acquired the heart that you always dreamed of, but it was but a mere prop for lies and deception. You will finally obtain what belongs to you, and this false construct of a body can at last aspire to power over this world." The mere prop for lies and deception is most likely his delusion, and what finally belongs to him is the gnosis A took away from him, because she thought him to be too fragile. He was originally born to be a vessel for a heart, but he shed tears in his dreams. His creator observed thus: he was too fragile, whether it be as a human or as a tool. Yet his creator would not destroy him, and so allowed him to continue slumbering. In her latter works, she would also consign designs that might store such a heart to obsolescence. Not long after, that noblest and most prestigious proof in the world would come to have no home, and thus was sent to the great shrine at Mount Yogo. He saw the people around him and became inspired by the nobler aspects of humanity, but then he meets the man in a coat that takes him to Snezhnaya. We know from Yai that Scaramouche's power pre-Fatui was concealed away, and it took the first 5 Harbingers to tap into the power in the first place. By doing so, they elevated his potential power by giving him the heart he desired. This new heart, in the form of a delusion, however, wasn't the epitome of good that Scaramouche desired. Later, the lovely puppet would finally obtain that heart. It was, after all, his purpose for being, the very reason he existed. Yet, it was not what the puppet truly desired, for it did not contain any blessings, but was instead a sacrifice brimming with selfishness, hypocrisy, cunning, and curses, all wrapped in an amiable husk. Good and evil were the song of sentient life, useless and cacophonous. But if he were to wrench this heart out, you would no longer be able to feel anything at all. I don't doubt that this is most likely the reason for Scaramouche's horrible attitude towards everyone. His sadistic nature and morbid curiosity are a byproduct of the attitudes implanted onto him by the delusion, and from this, we actually see the psychological consequences of using one. It's possible that Scaramouche's delusion feeds him empty promises, bringing forth this disgusting dependency to his delusions for fulfillment. In a way, it's almost ironic that he was the one that manipulated the Resistance's fragile desire for victory by giving them the delusions. Because, in a way, he too is using emotions to justify the use. The delusion's manipulation of emotional vulnerability is a theme that we see in both the game and the manga. In the game, we see this in the form of Teppei, who, while unaware it was a delusion, was still coping until the very end that it was all going to be okay, almost trying to deny the situation for himself. In the manga, however, we see a more direct approach to how the delusions work. Cole's black snake fed on her anger, amplifying when she saw the statue of the Seven. She herself holds resentment towards the gods because they showed favoritism in the form of visions. The way the snake speaks to her is coercive, using words like, "So what if it's from the fatui?" or "Don't worry," or "You'll feel so much better after." It goads her into using the power, not by insulting her for being weak, but by trying to convince her that she needs them. It was only when she forces herself out of that possession that the delusions go haywire, telling her that she was a foolish vessel. The delusions also tell her that you can't go against a god's will, further cementing that this is a demon god's power and what happens when you try to fight against a delusion's influence. Maybe this is why Scaramouche was hesitant to remove the heart even if he himself is aware it caused him pain. Maybe the same voices that haunted Calais follow through with other delusion users. And we do know that the best way to keep being a user is through dependency. Following through with this, it's also important to note that Scaramouche doesn't need a delusion. Actually, neither do Signora nor Tartaglia. Tartaglia has his vision and the foul legacy. Signora's Crimson Witch of Flames powers hurt her, yes, but she most likely has more polish in pyromancy than cryomancy, given this was what she studied in the academia. Lastly, Scaramouche has the power of the Electro Archon and Sealed. The three have separate capabilities that extend past the delusion's base power set, which is why it's important to put symbolic meaning behind delusions to justify their use. Why do these powerful people need delusions in the first place? Moreover, I want to continue speculating about the delusions by looking at the other Harbingers, specifically Pantalone and Dottore, two characters that weren't given the god's blessing of a vision. We can speculate what the delusions mean to them based on the Pale Flame artifacts. Both of these men have other agenda than simply power, as both lean towards the more internal affairs of the fatui. Pantalone controls the economic state of the fatui, while Dottore is more interested in the scientific benefits reaped from his endeavors. Let's start with Dottore. Dottore in the manga actually says that he doesn't have a vision, calling Allogene self-inflated fools. This reflects well with the wise doctor's opinion. A human is nothing more than a machine of a certain level of complexity. If one were to disassemble a part of this machine and make enhancements to it, its performance could be greatly amplified. With or without a vision, and irrespective of their physique or combat skills, enhanced humans would surely display strength far beyond the average. His bigger agenda is that he wants to create enhanced humans greater than a god, and this is unfortunately reflected in the experiments under his division. He can put dead people into robots, or he can experiment on people altogether. The goal is to further human evolution by making humanity physically greater than what it currently is. I believe this is what his delusion represents. What better way to experiment the prospect of enhanced humanity than by experimenting on yourself? It would be horribly impractical for him not to benefit from his own research. The motif of artificial enhancement is perfectly done in a delusion being the necessary tool humans can use to achieve beyond godhood. Now, Pantalone on the other hand is a much more difficult person to discern. If you had to ask me, I believe he doesn't even care about his delusion, wanting more to focus on the business aspects of the fatui more than anything else. Pantalone is an economic genius, responsible for most of the fatui's capitalization of other nations' resources. Not only is he accustomed to the target market, like with the establishment of the Northland Bank in the Land of Commerce, but he also knows the best way to attack the nation's gross income is by toppling their monopoly. For example, Pantalone has an agent that is responsible in prying into the wine industry of Mondstadt, the largest industry in the Animo nation. Therefore, a delusion, in my opinion, would be meaningless to him, other than just being a standard badge of identity to solidify his status. However, in the moment of cessation, we actually get a more internal monologue of why Pantalone does what he does. He was not one of the favored, and could only pursue worldly power, but though money ought to mean nothing to the gods, they held it firmly within their grasp nonetheless, along with the countless other forms of power that they wielded. Perhaps he lusted for money because he had once been destitute, or perhaps the fact that the gods had never looked upon him with favor ignited a burning desire for resistance inside him. A delusion to him wouldn't be a business tool, but instead something more personal, a physical and material manifestation of his resistance to the gods he deemed as greedy. Think about it this way: the best way for a person to resist against something is by creating and using an imitation, or better yet, an improvement of something that other person created. Delusions are the biggest slap to the gods' faces, saying that they don't need the gods' approval for power, especially since the gods are too greedy to give it. But yes, that's mostly it. Now, you may be wondering where Piero is in all of this, but I actually wanted to cover him in a separate video altogether. The reason being is that Piero's story might be more convoluted than what meets the eye. Anyway, my name is Aster, and thank you for chilling with me.